So let's talk for a minute about pressure, flow, and valves. As we're talking about the heart, we're going to need to understand how it is that the heart moves things around, moves blood around in the blood vessels and between chambers of the heart, and how the valves stop the blood from going in the wrong direction. So let's start just by imagining a water balloon. So here's my water balloon. Now, if I squeeze this part of the water balloon, what I'm doing is applying pressure to the water there. And what's going to happen when I squeeze this part of the water balloon? What I expect to happen is that this other end will expand. Now, that's intuitive. You kind of know that already, but let's think about what's actually happening there. When I press in on the water in this part of the balloon, that pressure is transmitted out through all of the water. The pressure is now applying everywhere. Here, my hands are stopping the balloon from expanding, but now this part is experiencing outward pressure. So this expands and the fluid flows toward that end of the water balloon. In other words, when I apply pressure to part of the balloon, it causes a change. It causes the fluid to flow from where there's high pressure to where there's low pressure. So applying pressure there makes the water go that way. That's really almost the entire concept of flow. Fluids flow from high to low pressure. Now, if I had this entire water balloon encased in something rigid that wouldn't let it expand, and I pressed in on one side, then the water wouldn't flow anywhere because that rigid exterior is applying enough pressure elsewhere that I can't move the water around. But assuming it's flexible or there's an opening somewhere, then I can cause the water to flow by applying pressure in one area. It works similarly in the heart. Let's just take a look at one side of the heart here. If I apply pressure here in the ventricle, so if the walls of the ventricle push in, that makes the ventricular pressure go up. If the pressure in the ventricles is higher than the pressure here in the arteries, then which way is the blood going to go? Well, if it flows from high to low, then the blood will go that way, outward. Now let's imagine, though, that during ventricular contraction, the pressure in the ventricles can be higher than the pressure in the arteries, which is where we want the blood to go. But it's also higher than the pressure in the atria, and we don't want the blood to go that way. We want the blood to go veins to atria, atria to ventricles, ventricles to arteries. But when the pressure in here is high, it should try to push blood backward into the atria too. The way we stop that is by having these one-way valves. Here, this atrioventricular valve works a little bit like a one-way door with a little door stop on it. It allows things to go this way. If I press harder here, then the door opens and things will go through the door. But if I press hard on this side more than that side, then my door will swing shut up against that stop and nothing's going to go through. This becomes a one-way door. It only allows things to go through that way. In the same way, this valve will be open when pressure is higher here than here. It allows flow in this direction. But if the pressure in the ventricles is higher than the pressure in the artery, in the atrium, blood will try to flow backward, but that valve will shut and the blood won't be able to go that way. Instead, once the pressure here is higher than here, it'll go outward. That concept is really important for understanding what we're about to talk about around the heart. So you need to know fluids like blood flow from where there's high to low pressure, and the heart has one-way valves, which will open when the pressure difference is in one direction, but will close and not allow flow if the pressure difference is in the other direction. Now, we're about to talk about the cardiac cycle. which is the sequence of events that causes blood to move through the heart. And when we do that, we're going to be talking about pressure in the atria, or atrial pressure, pressure in the ventricles, ventricular pressure, and pressure in the arteries, or arterial pressure. You're going to need to keep track of which pressure is higher at any given moment. So if, for example, if we say that ventricular pressure is greater than arterial pressure, that means the pressure here is greater than the pressure here. Which way is blood going to flow in that case? Yes. If the pressure is higher here than here, blood is going to flow from ventricles to the arteries. But if I said arterial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, which way is blood going to try to flow, and will it be able to? In this case, if the pressure here is higher than here, blood will try to flow from arteries to ventricles. But this valve, the semilunar valve, doesn't allow flow in that direction. The semilunar valve will close and prevent the blood from flowing backward. So make sure you keep those ideas in mind as we talk about the cardiac cycle. And if you can do that, you'll be okay understanding which way blood is going. The cardiac cycle is divided up into phases. We divide it based on when blood is going from one place to another, which is largely governed by when valves open and close, which is governed by when the pressure changes. So I'm going to start in one particular phase of the cycle, but like any cycle, we're going to go back to that phase. This is not something that starts there. That's just where we're going to start talking about it. Now, two other terms I need to define before we talk about this. Systole means contraction. And diastole means relaxation. So we're going to be talking about atrial systole, atrial diastole, ventricular systole, ventricular diastole. You'll need to know those words. So I'm going to erase those just to make sure I have some room to work with. We're going to start in the phase that we spend the most time in, which is atrial and ventricular diastole. So based on what you just learned, this is the time when both the atria and the ventricles are relaxed. So this is the time in the heart. We'll sketch a little heart here. So in here right now, blood is coming to the heart because the atria are relaxed. So the pressure in the atria is very low, and blood is coming to the atria from the veins. So let's just sketch that in here. So blood is entering the atria, which means atrial pressure is slightly rising as you're adding more blood to it. So during this time, atrial pressure, the pressure in the atria is higher than the pressure in the ventricles because they're getting new blood and the ventricles are not. So we'll say atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure. Now, if the pressure in the atria is greater than the ventricles, which way is the blood going to be going? Yes, the blood will be moving downward from the atria to the ventricles, and these valves, the atrioventricular valves, do allow that flow. So during this time, blood is moving down through these open valves. So we can say that this means that the atrioventricular valves are open and blood is draining from the atria to the ventricles. So then our question becomes, as blood is filling the ventricles, what do we know about the pressure in the ventricles compared to the arteries? Is the blood going outward? And here, just for now, you're going to have to take my word for it. The pressure in the arteries is still pretty high. There's still a lot of pressure in the arteries, much more than in the ventricles. So right now we would say arterial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure. Notice these words, atrial, arterial. Don't mix those up. Because of that, if the pressure in the arteries is higher than the ventricles, the blood would be trying to flow backward into the ventricles. But these valves, the semilunar valves, won't allow that. If blood tries to flow backward, they will close. So this means the semilunar valves are closed. So we'll draw that on here. Closed valves. Now, this situation is going to continue until the heartbeat actually starts. So the next thing that's going to happen is that the SA node up here in the wall of the right atrium is going to fire off an action potential, which is going to start spreading through the atria, causing them to twitch. That's going to raise atrial pressure, and that's going to lead us into our next phase. So let's erase this and go to the next phase, which is atrial systole. If I were taking notes on this, I would write each of these side by side as a sequence of phases, kind of like we did with the contractile cycle. Now, in atrial systole, this starts with the SA node fires, an action potential spreads through the atria, which causes the atria to contract. That's going to increase the pressure in the atrium, which is going to push more blood down into the ventricles. So the ventricles were already filling, but as the atria contract, they squeeze a little more. They sort of top off the ventricles. Now, that's also going to push a little blood backward out into the veins. We're just going to show that as no more blood is coming in. So here during atrial systole, we push a little extra blood in here into the ventricles. So now they're reaching their maximum fill. The pressure in here is still lower than the pressure in the arteries, which means those semilunar valves are still closed. So nothing is coming backward through there. Now, that will then last as long as the atria are twitching. Remember, during that time, the action potential has already gone down to the AV node and is working its way through the AV node in the bundle of His. About the time the atria finish their contraction, that signal will move down through the bundle branches to the apex of the heart, up through the Purkinje fibers into the ventricular muscle, and then start the ventricular contraction. That's going to be the start of the next phase of the cardiac cycle. So, erase, and our next phase is called isovolumic ventricular contraction. Sometimes this is called early ventricular systole. So you can think of ventricular systole, the contraction of the ventricles, happening in two parts. This is the first part of ventricular systole, isovolumic contraction. So this begins with the R wave. The contraction begins in the ventricular muscle. So when that happens, the ventricles start to twitch. Remember, they're much stronger than the atria. So the first thing that happens is ventricular pressure rises above atrial pressure. Now, that's going to make blood try to flow from the ventricles to the atria. But remember, the atrioventricular valves aren't going to allow that. So this is going to cause this flow downward to stop, and as the blood tries to flow backward, the atrioventricular valves will shut. So the blood can't go backward at this point. It runs up against the closed valves. However, the ventricles have just started contracting, which means while the pressure in here rises above atrial pressure, it's still lower than arterial pressure. So we'd say this causes the AV valves to shut or to close. Leave a little space here in your notes. We're going to come to something about that in just a moment. But we'd still say that ventricular pressure is still less than arterial pressure, which means the semilunar valves are still closed. They were closed before, and they are still closed. So for a moment here, we have a time when no blood is getting into the ventricles because those AV valves are closed, and no blood is leaving the ventricles because the semilunar valves are closed. Here at the beginning of ventricular contraction, we have a short time, few dozen milliseconds, when the ventricles are squeezing but there's nowhere for the blood to go, which means the amount of blood in the ventricles isn't changing during this time, hence the name isovolumic, same volume. Now, one thing that you should know about this is when this phase begins, when the ventricles start to contract, the blood tries to flow back into the atria and closes those AV valves, that actually leads to our first heart sound. Lub. This sound comes from the fact that as the last blood is flowing through those valve flaps, and the flaps are now closing as blood is starting to flow backward, that causes turbulence in the blood flow. Turbulence is noisy. So, as you might imagine, if you're looking at a stream flowing where it's deep and quiet, the water is moving, but it's not making a lot of noise. Where if it's in a shallower area and kind of bumpy and bubbly, you hear more noise. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's sort of right. Blood flowing through this narrowing valve as it's closing becomes turbulent, and it makes a sound, which if you're listening from the outside sounds like lub. So that's our first heart sound. As these valves close, all of the heart sounds come from closing valves. It's not actually the sound of the valve flaps hitting each other. That's quiet. It's the turbulent blood through through the valve as it gets narrower. Now, this phase of the cardiac cycle will last until the rising pressure in the ventricles is enough to overcome the pressure in the arteries. Once the pressure in the ventricles is greater than the pressure in the arteries, that will push these valves open and blood will leave, and that'll put us into our next phase. One more thing I should mention. As the pressure in these ventricles is rising and the blood has nowhere to go, it starts to push back on these valve flaps, pushing them sort of backward into the atria. So you can almost imagine them bulging backward a little bit. That actually causes a temporary increase in the pressure in the atria as we're pushing that wall back up. As soon as the blood comes out through these arteries, that pressure will be relieved. So that's our next phase. So erase, and we go into ventricular ejection, which is the second part of ventricular systole, the second part of contraction. Ventricular ejection begins when the ventricular pressure rises above arterial pressure. When that happens, it's enough to force these valve flaps open. And the blood that had been building up in these ventricles and was under increasing pressure now starts flowing outward into the arteries and away from the heart. That relieves some of the pressure in these ventricles. The pressure in the ventricles will actually keep rising, but as the blood has somewhere to go, these valves stop bulging backward into the atrial, though they do stay closed. So the extra pressure on the atria is relieved, which actually allows some blood to start coming into the atria again. So blood from the veins now starts filling the atria as the blood in the ventricles is leaving out through the arteries. Now at this point, the ventricular pressure is still greater than atrial pressure, so the AV valves stay closed. But this causes the semilunar valves to open, and blood flows from the ventricles to the arteries. Now do note what that's going to do. Now that we're pushing blood out into the arteries, all of that high pressure ventricular blood is now being transmitted out here. Now the arteries are under pressure. So their pressure is now going to rise along with the ventricular pressure. So this phase of the cardiac cycle, ejection, will last as long as those ventricles are squeezing. But the moment they start to relax, the arteries whose walls got pushed outward by this, now those elastic arterial walls start to spring back. And pretty quickly, the pressure in the ventricles, once they are finishing with their twitch, will start to fall. And very quickly, blood will try to flow backward from those arteries back into the ventricles. When that happens, think about what will happen to these semilunar valves. As that blood tries to flow backward, those semilunar valves aren't going to allow it. They're going to swing shut and stop that backflow. As they shut, we're going to go into the next phase. So we're almost done. Erase. And we are now in isovolumic ventricular relaxation, which is sometimes called early ventricular diastole. This is the name I prefer, isovolumic ventricular relaxation. This happens when the ventricular pressure drops lower than arterial pressure. So when that happens, blood is going to try to flow backward from arteries to ventricles, but it's not going to be able to because that will cause the semilunar valves to close. Now, just like, remember, when the atrioventricular valves closed, and you got a sound from the blood flowing through that narrowing valve, you get the same thing here. When the semilunar valves close, the last blood flowing through them becomes turbulent, and we get a sound, which is the second heart sound. Dub. So this is the dub. Anyway, at this point, while the ventricular pressure has dropped below arterial pressure, it's still greater than the atrial pressure, which means the atrioventricular valves are still closed. Blood is filling the atria from the veins, but it isn't yet enough. These haven't relaxed enough and this hasn't filled enough for the pressure in here to push those valves open. So just like before, for a moment here, we have a time when the ventricles are relaxing and no blood can come back, but no blood can come into them from the atria. So we have an isovolumic period, hence the name. That's going to last until the ventricles relax enough that the pressure in the ventricles drops below the pressure in the atria, which will then allow the atrioventricular valves to open and blood to flow down from atria to ventricles. So that'll take us to our last part, which is the same as the first. We are now into atrial and ventricular diastole. At this point, ventricular pressure drops below atrial pressure. Which means these atrioventricular valves open up. And the blood which had been building up in the atria starts draining into the ventricles. And we're back where we started. So that is one cardiac cycle. Now, I'm going to now kind of sketch these on this diagram. You may want to look at your notes as you do this, and even go back through this video as I'm sketching these out and talking about it, and try to kind of match them up so you can see how this all works together. That's actually going to be the beginning of the Wiggers diagram.